We brought you this story when Project Veritas brought us this story, all of us. This is back 2 years ago, July of 21. It was a whistleblower inside the Hasbro toy company named David Johnson who detailed the dye indoctrination that was going on inside the company. They brought in, one of these race hustlers to do a training for the employees. And she was saying things like, if you don't uh, take what you've learned here and indoctrinate your kids by the age of 5, these white kids are David Duke. I mean, literally, he would say things like that. And we're supposed to look at, of course, product lines that were alleged to perpetuate anti-blackness, to close the racial empathy gap in this country, and so on and so forth. Here's what was said at the time.
Tape of the training.
I think we should
be recorded.
By 3 to 6 months, babies are beginning to notice and already express preference by race. There was research that looked at how by 6 months, infants living in a homogenous or same race neighborhood showed preferences for faces from their own racial groups, whereas infants living in more racially diverse environments did not show that same preference for their own racial group. And this is really important because we see that early exposure to different races is impacting these preferences before babies are even 1 year old. Children as young as 2 are already using race to reason about people's behaviors, and we may see this play out in daycare or on the playground in how kids are starting to choose or exclude playmates and friends.
Yeah, the conscious kid, the name of this instructional, worrying about, I'm sure you've seen it, 3, 4, 5-year-olds in daycare on the playground wearing white hoods because they haven't had exposure to Katie Ishizuka Stevens in her race hustle. Here's what was going on at Hasbro.
They are attempting to covertly push CRT, critical race theory, through branding and messaging through their products.
Explain what we're looking at here.
This is the program developed by the Conscious Kid, which is working with Hasbro. I'm not sure exactly to what extent, but this is their program to teach children about, well, teach is a strong word, but they want to introduce children into racial bias at an early age before they're really able to understand what race and racism is.
Is this a mandatory all-hands training?
Yes, this meeting was attended by, well, you can see at least 44 people. I remember being more on my screen, but it was mandatory for me.
That was David Johnson, and now we're joined by David Johnson. He's a former packaging engineer for Hasbro who exposed what was going on inside the company, as he was describing 2 years ago, and as you heard from that race hustler that I referenced. His new book, The Diversity Con, The Secrets and Lies Behind the Shady DEI Industry. David Johnson, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So, before we get to sort of what happened after you blew the whistle on Hasbro, give us more color, because I think this is still surprising to people in corporate America how much indoctrination is efforted through the HR departments and the dye consultants. Give us more of what was going on at Hasbro during your time there.
Sure. So that meeting that you played clips of was the only one that I attended. Shortly after that, my story broke, and then I was removed from all Hasbro access at my job. But Hasbro has a history of doing this. It's not the first time they worked with the Conscious Kid, and they have made other product lines specifically aiming to teach children to focus more on race, ethnicity, and the color of their peers, as opposed to the more what you could say American ideal of color blindness and judging people by their character.
But what was the corporate
But
culture there?
Hasbro,
What was the corporate culture like? The employees? Is this a situation where college educated millennials and Gen Zers had taken over, essentially taken over the company, or what was the dynamic?
on the surface, the dynamic of the company seemed pretty normal. But you could tell like Hasbro's a very progressive leaning company. Every email signature has pronouns in the bio.
There you go.
It's that kind of workplace, but it's becoming more and more standard for many companies in corporate America to be adopting these the DEI practices. A lot of them just because it's being pushed down from higher up their corporate ladder. But like you said, there are also a lot of young millennials getting into HR that are pushing these ideologies as well.
And so you do this sit down with James O'Keefe at the time in Project Veritas. You told us what happened in terms of your employment situation. What what were your conversations about things like the conscious kid with your colleagues at work, and what was their reaction when you blew the whistle on all of this?
I actually didn't get the opportunity to speak with any of my coworkers. I was very, very new at Hasbro at the time. I was on a short contract. So this happened to me just as I was getting used to working at Hasbro, unfortunately.
I see.
So I didn't even have the chance to discuss it with any peers. At the end of the meeting, there was a small Q&A. Not many other people really commented on it. There's just some small like clapping emojis and people asking, how can I do my part, that kind of thing.
And so the posture of well, how can I do my part? Right, everybody wants to play ball because you want to climb the corporate ladder. So Hasbro made it clear this is what you have to do. You have to be oriented this way, ideologically, and then we can have a conversation about how you can participate and be successful at Hasbro, essentially.
Yeah, basically that. But it's not the first time, and Hasbro's not even close to being the only large corporation to be pushing these DEI practices down on their employees. You can see it reflected in, and I bring this up in the book, other large companies such as YouTube, Nickelodeon, the NFL, like major institutions all have access to children through media. And this is why it's so insidious, and parents need to be aware of what their children are being exposed to.
What's what do you come to the table with here? What's your sort of a disposition? Why did you recoil at this? Why did you seek out Project Veritas, or maybe they sought you out? I'm not sure which, but give us that kind of angle. What's your angle here?
For me at the time, I was just appalled that I was being expected to push racial and gender propaganda at my place of work. It's something I'd seen a lot of through videos on other college campuses of young students becoming deranged activists pushing these types of things. But just to have it at my place of work was just so shocking to me. And that Hasbro wanted to do it covertly, I just felt that I had a duty to let as many people know about this as I could. Project Veritas was just the only institution I had some trust in at the time, so I brought it to them, thankfully. And they did the story proper justice and got it the attention it needed.
But you're black. And what was your breaking point, though? What was where you're like, you know what, I got to contact them?
For me, it was at 4 years old, the white children are going to be experiencing this level of racial bias as their parents. I grew up in upstate New York, which is very, very diverse and very mixed. There's white people, there's black people, there's people from many other countries, first and second generation immigrant families. And that racist propaganda was not my experience growing up. And I was also I have a strong hatred of the racial propaganda that tells minorities that they can't achieve unless they're given special treatment and special handouts, because that disincentivizes them from working hard. So it was a lot of just moral outrage on my part at the time.
And give us some more perspective on your work history. Where did you go from Hasbro? Sort of what other corporate environments have you been in, and what has been your experience in those environments?
I've worked all over. Hasbro was more just like a remote engineering job, but I've worked in like blue collar factories. I've worked at other packaging engineering companies. So I've worked in a pretty large mix of environments. Hasbro didn't really stand out compared to any of the others, but when I brought the story to Project Veritas, I thought, even though the Hasbro job was very prestigious and could have opened a lot of doors for me, that it would be better to go back and work at a factory than support their racial propaganda.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I appreciate that and respect it, but can you distinguish, the sort of companies that you've worked at where they're either, more or less oriented towards this racial propaganda as you describe it? Do you think it's predicated on size or sector? Since you have sort of a broad level of experience in business settings, including corporate.
I would say no. Large companies are more vulnerable to this just because there are large companies such as like BlackRock and Vanguard that push down on other companies through like ESG programs to promote these ideas. Small companies aren't as affected, but as they grow and start to contract with other large companies, then it's kind of pushed onto them as well.
And the desire to write the book. I mean, it sounds pretty straightforward, but maybe there's another motivation, just to continue to speak out against this sort of racial propagandizing. Is that the impetus?
Racial and gender propaganda. I think both of them are just as insidious, and the gender propaganda might even be more harmful. In part because it convinces young children to get sex change surgeries and mutilate themselves, which leads them down a self-destructive path. But also it has the side effect of slandering the, I guess you could say, gay demographic as being a bunch of people who are out to predate on children, when the truth is there are predators using the gay demographic as shields, which is also something I call out in the book.
Interesting. I mean, there's you're an engineer, so you're a sophisticated guy intellectually, but I mean, the sort of political and philosophical orientation, is that something that you developed through parental and parental mentorship and mentorship in school? Is there any particular experience that informs your views on this beyond your own, or where does that come from?
I'd say the root of it does come from my upbringing. I was raised to read and learn the ideals of Martin Luther King, that people should be judged based on their character and not their skin color or how they look. But I also lived in Portland, Oregon for a little bit, where I got to see the end result and the most extreme versions of these progressive ideologies in real time, and I got to see how destructive and divisive it was. So that kind of also helped form my current ideals.
Well, that's very interesting, and good for you for stepping out when few will do so in corporate America, particularly if there's a cost to be paid. David Johnson's a former packaging engineer for Hasbro, who you, as we've been discussing, as you heard, exposed the racial propagandizing inside Hasbro in a piece that Project Veritas did a couple of years ago. His new book, pick it up, The Diversity Con, The Secrets and Lies Behind the Shady DEI Industry. David, thanks so much for joining us. Good luck with the book.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, and he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
More Chicago radio listeners are choosing. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Why are the world's central banks quietly yet aggressively amassing mountains of gold? Because they know a storm is brewing, the type we might witness only once in our lifetimes. They understand that America's vastly inflated